it. Yes, so in terms of who am I, obviously it's been announced. I'm Christina's identical twin sister. So obviously I'm very passionate about people who are living with lymphoma because my very own family member did. And I'm also obviously a runner, but I'm a registered dietitian. So the only disclosure I have is that I'm a full-time employee of Loblaw Companies Limited. I'm not really going to be promoting any products or anything like that, but just good for you to know. So today we're going to discuss the difference between dietitians and nutritionists. We're going to discuss nutrition during and after treatment for lymphoma. I'm going to dispel a few myths around cancer and diet, and then at the end I'm going to point you to some reliable nutrition resources. So I know in the last session they were talking about where can we find good information. I'll talk about that at the end as well, and then we'll have a little bit of time maybe for questions. So dietitian versus nutritionist. This is a question I get all the time in my practice. Sometimes people are actually seeking out, they think they're seeking out nutritionists, but really what they need is a dietitian. So what it breaks down to is the difference is in the education and the regulation. So registered dietitians have to do a 4-year university degree in science with a specialization in nutrition and dietetics. And some dietitians come to this actually as a second degree because there's only 3 schools that offer this specific program because we learn the vast majority of the information in our undergrad. So you have to do that, and then following your undergrad degree, you have to apply. Either you do an internship or a 2-year master's program. And then after that, we write the Canadian Dietetic Registration Exam, and then you're a fully qualified dietitian, and you have to belong to the College of Dietitians of Ontario. So any of the medical professionals in the room, you probably know that you belong to your college, whether it's like the College of Physicians and Surgeons, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a pharmacist. So that's there to protect the public. So that does nothing really for us as dietitians. That's not our professional association. That's just there to protect you. Whereas nutritionists, there's no law or anything to regulate that term. So any single person in this room, you can call yourself a nutritionist. It's not a protected term. It really means nothing, including when people say they're a registered nutritionist. So I see that all the time online, and it's actually kind of misleading to the public because it really doesn't mean anything. It's not a regulated term. Same with, basically registered holistic nutritionist. It's all the same type of thing. Someone could do a weekend course and call themselves a nutritionist, or they could do nothing at all. Or they could do more rigorous programs, but it's just good to know that there is a difference. If you're being treated for cancer, I think you definitely want to see a dietitian. It's really important. So first, we'll talk about nutrition during treatment. So when you're actively undergoing chemotherapy or radiation, dietitians have a few goals when they're helping patients. Obviously, you'd want to prevent or reverse any nutrient deficiencies. You want to preserve as much of the lean body mass as possible and minimize any nutrition-related side effects. So that's within our scope. So decreased appetite, nausea, taste changes, or changes in bowel movements, maybe constipation, diarrhea. We're trying to manage all of those things. And this is listed at the bottom, but I think this might be the most important. So maximizing quality of life, especially considering obviously some people with lymphoma are being treated for a long amount of time or over certain periods. When I'm talking about healthy eating, just keep in mind, if the only thing you can eat is like an entree or something that's like sugary, it doesn't matter. You still have to eat your food, and obviously quality of life is important as well. So just keep that in mind. By a show of hands, how many people here have seen this graphic before? A lot of people. So if you raised your hand, you might know that this is based on the new Canada's Food Guide. So this was kind of the balanced healthy plate that dietitians have been using for more than a decade. The old Canada's Food Guide hadn't been updated since 2007, and this just came out this year. So it was a rainbow. It held all these serving size based on gender and age. It wasn't very user-friendly. I know most dietitians didn't use it. Maybe they used it a bit with children in school groups just to teach them about the different types of food, but it wasn't very practical. I like this a lot better just because it's showing you kind of what a general healthy meal looks like, let's say for lunch or dinner. So half of our plate would be fruits and vegetables. The bottom quarter would be whole grain foods, and the top quarter is protein foods. So that would include things like beans, lentils, legumes, eggs, distilled dairy products, meat, chicken, all of those types of things. So when you can, and if you're feeling well enough to eat like vegetables, that's kind of how I would do it. But if you're at times where you're either having a lot of diarrhea or constipation and fiber is an issue, then that's something you would want to talk with your dietitian about and modify your diet appropriately. And I'll talk about some good resources for that later. So basically it comes down to some pretty simple information, but good things to keep in mind. So we want to choose whole grains as often as we can. That means when we're picking a bread in the grocery store or we're trying to pick pasta and things like that, you want to go for the ones that say whole grain as the first ingredient. That's because it has all three parts of the grain, and the parts of the grain that are stripped when you get things like white bread actually contain the most nutrients. So all of our B vitamins, our healthy fats, everything like that. Something that I think we could all do as well is increasing our intake of fruits, vegetables, and legumes. I've never had one patient come to me who's been eating too many vegetables. So that even if we feel like we're eating a lot, usually there's some room to add extra things in. So even if you can only do one thing for your health, something good would be to try to increase those. It's simple, but it's very good for us. And then as well, if you're not feeling like you have a big appetite, you'd want to make sure you're eating small meals and snacks throughout the day to make sure you're getting enough. We also want to reduce our intake of simple sugars and refined carbohydrates. So one quick area that you can kind of decrease is sugary drinks. So a lot of people don't realize how much sugar they're getting from something, even like juices, even natural juices. So in 1 cup of like regular grape juice, even the ones that say no sugar added on the front, they have 41 grams of sugar. So when the World Health Organization says to keep it to less than 25 to 50 a day, and 1 cup of juice has 41, we know that that's kind of getting a little bit high. So that's what I would suggest decreasing first. Also limiting your intake of red meat. So I think it's great, it has iron and lots of other nutrients, but if we don't want to be having it every day of the week, and certain people have it more than others. So if you're having it twice a day, I would try to cut it down to only once a day, or if you're having daily, maybe you have it 3 times a week. And the other main recommendation would be to avoid processed meats and alcoholic drinks. We know those aren't good for us with cancer or without. Now we're going to talk about some of the common side effects of cancer treatments and ways we can manage them a bit with our nutrition. So nausea is a very common one for lots of people, and the first thing I would do is to try to stay really well hydrated. And eat throughout the day. So sometimes people find if they have a little bit in their stomach, it doesn't get as bad. And I also read in this book that when we think we're going to be nauseous, it actually brings on the nausea. So it's a little bit of our mind as well. But you also want to just have simple dry foods like crackers, toast, dry cereal, and pretzels, and then alternate these with fluids. Some people find it's helpful to avoid oily or fatty foods or have foods that are at room temperature. If we heat foods up, sometimes people find that that aroma makes them not feel so good. So if you need to have your foods at room temperature, that's okay. Another very common side effect would be taste changes, and I know this is something my own sister had as well. So what you can start with is good general mouth hygiene, so rinsing your mouth before and after eating to help clear your taste buds and make sure you keep your mouth and teeth very clean. Something that can be helpful too is trying foods and beverages that are different from the ones you normally eat. Let's say you have a favorite recipe and you're experiencing taste changes and it tastes totally different. We don't want to ruin that recipe that we used to know and love, so maybe try something totally different that you're not used to. I know my sister, she hadn't had Kraft Dinner in years, and for some reason when she was going through chemo, she felt like she wanted Kraft Dinner. So even though like I was becoming a dietitian, it's not like, oh, don't eat that Kraft Dinner. If that's the only thing that she can stomach that day, then that's what she's gonna eat. So just keep that in mind. Yes, and again with the room temperature, that can help with taste changes as well. Something else some of you may have experienced is when your mouth actually tastes like metallic. So in that situation, it might be good to try plastic cutlery or glass cooking pots and see if that makes a bit of a difference. And if it does appeal to you and you think you can stomach it, you might want to experiment with seasonings and spices as well. You can also suck on lemon candies, mints, or chewing gum, and to get rid of some of the unpleasant tastes, and drink plenty of fluids. So when I was talking to my sister about this, she said even though they tell you you're supposed to drink a lot of water and it's really good for you, when your mouth does taste like that, if you don't like drinking the water, then you can add a little bit of flavor to it. So even if it's some of those, like, you know, those little things you can buy at the grocery store that you flavor your water with, or maybe trying a sparkling water that's already flavored, or maybe a juice that's been really watered down. They sell those all the time in the grocery store. Just do what you can to make sure you're still getting hydrated, basically, is the point. Milk can work as well. And then chew slowly. Another common side effect would be loss of appetite. So you know how some of the patients and stuff we're talking about, you feel really fatigued. Sometimes people just do not feel motivated to eat at all. So if this is happening to you or your loved one, just try not to fill up on the fluids before the main meals are going to be served. That way we can make sure we can get in as lot of the food as you can. Serving the food on a smaller plate can help as well. Even if it's only like a bread-sized plate, sometimes large plates can be really overwhelming to us. I know I used to work in long-term care, and sometimes it's just so overwhelming to the older people, and if we're trying to increase their appetite, it doesn't help them to see a whole plate of food that they don't want to eat. So you can serve it on little plates, and then if they want more, you can just bring another small plate. Like I said before, eat little and often with small snacks in between meals. And then if you are having a low appetite, it's good to choose the high energy density foods like omelets, cheese, biscuits. You don't want to just choose things like salads and soups that, even though they provide a lot of nutrients, they don't have many calories. Or you can also add things into your food like olive oil, cream, cheese, or milk powder. So you can actually buy plain skim milk powder. Sometimes people add that to things like oatmeal, or you can actually make yourself a high protein milk by adding skim milk powder to a glass of milk. So that's something good to try. If you are losing weight, you want to make sure you choose the full fat options like whole milk over the lower fat alternatives. Something where this can be true too, as well, is yogurts. So there's a lot of high protein, high fat yogurts, like a skyr yogurt, which is an Icelandic style one. You can try that. Or you can add things to your regular foods or vegetables like cheese and things like that. If you do continue to lose weight, I would suggest being asked to be referred to your dietitian, because they can provide you with lots of meal suggestions, ways to cook, things to add, and personalize it to you and your likes and dislikes. Another side effect that sometimes people don't anticipate when they are going through treatment is that they actually might gain weight. So lots of times people think about people with cancer who just are losing all this weight from all these treatments and they're not eating well. But if you are eating well, because of the steroids and stuff, you might actually gain weight. So in that instance, I would really encourage you not to be worried about your weight. Continue to eat food, continue to try to nourish yourself properly. Your weight might change after the treatment's done and after you're done the steroids. But the most important thing is not necessarily your body weight, but making sure you're getting enough. Another common side effect would be dry mouth. So if this is happening to you, you want to make sure you choose foods that are more moist. So you can add things like butter, margarine, mayo, broth, yogurt, milk, water, even gravy to certain foods. Just anything to keep it nice and soft and eat better for your mouth. Like even sometimes people dunk foods into certain liquids or add those types of things, and drinking lots of water. Again, you might also want to rinse your mouth with water before eating. Limiting caffeine might be helpful. Some people find it good to sip on soda water or sparkling water to help loosen the saliva. And of course, limit things like salty and spicy foods, and avoid alcohol and tobacco. So once you're done treatment, maybe you're out of the hospital, you're not doing chemotherapy or radiation, sometimes people start to wonder what they should eat, hopefully to help prevent cancer from coming back, or just as a general healthy diet. So I want to say one thing for sure, that we can do the best we can, and it is good to follow some of these principles I'm going to talk about, but at the end of the day, it's not people's fault when they get cancer. So even if you eat a super healthy diet, people still get cancer. So just knowing that we only have so much control over our bodies, and sometimes even if we eat like all kinds of fruits and vegetables and things like that, we might still get cancer. So these are the main principles. They're actually outlined in a book that I'll show you. Has anyone ever seen this book, The Essential Cancer Treatment Nutrition Guide and Cookbook? Yeah, there was actually a doctor I saw on the agenda who contributed to this book, Dr. Neil Bernstein. I don't know if anyone attended his session this morning. This is a really good book. It has lots of recipes and everything like that. It was actually written by someone who had Hodgkin's lymphoma. So she's a registered dietitian who had Hodgkin's lymphoma in her 20s, and then she wrote this book. So if you're interested in a great resource, this is something that I would look up. It comes with lots of recipes for certain side effects. So let's say you have nausea, it has ones that recommend that, or loss of appetite. Lots of great things in here. So this is something I'll mention again at the end, but I just wanted to point it out because that's where I got some of the information from. So one thing that we know is that plant-based diets with lots of fruits and vegetables, like I mentioned earlier, are very health-promoting diets. So that's something I would definitely focus on. Something else is consuming lots of omega-3s and try to reduce our intake of omega-6s, which I'll talk about more. And then, like I mentioned earlier, just limiting our refined sugars and avoiding processed meat and alcohol. So in terms of really nutrient-dense foods, it's always good to add color to our plate. When I'm explaining nutrition to young kids, I talk about how when we're in the grocery store and we're looking at all the fruits and vegetables, we notice there's like a rainbow of colors. So different color fruits and vegetables have different nutrients. So we don't want to only stick to green vegetables or only have apples and bananas. Try to get as much variety as you can because all different fruits and vegetables have different types of vitamin and nutrient profiles. It's also good to include raw cruciferous vegetables like all the ones listed up here. And I know when I was listening to a talk on nutrition and cancer, one person was talking about how, I forget which university it was in the United States, but they spent a long time studying broccoli, and they found out that the nutrients that people say are like cancer fighting are the best when you steam broccoli between 4 to 5 minutes. So I thought that was an interesting piece of information. Obviously, it's not going to prevent all cancers, but it was something that I thought was good. I do want to say, though, even though raw is good, you can also cook your vegetables. Certain vegetables are actually better absorbed when they are cooked. If I can think of something, it's like spinach. And sometimes they're easier to digest as well. So I had a client one time who was kind of going through cancer treatment, and basically she had a recommendation from a nutritionist to consume a raw vegan diet. Now, the reason this is especially not good is because she had colon cancer, and so she already had problems with her bowel movements, so that was really not good advice. So if you need to have cooked vegetables to digest them properly, then that's something good to do. And again, that just points to make sure you're getting your nutrition advice from qualified professionals. If someone tells you that you need to do this certain type of fad diet, then I would just run in the other direction because that's not going to be very helpful. So here are some recommended spices that people say have anti-inflammatory properties. So it's good to keep in mind that even though these might help, or in certain studies they might show beneficial effects, they're still like widely debated, and there's no like this is the cure-all for everything. But since these are good in food and they add flavor and things like that, I don't think it's harmful to try. But I would only have these as like complementing the food, not as supplements. Actually, someone died from having turmeric injected into their veins by a naturopath in the United States. So just because something's good for us to eat doesn't mean we want to start putting it into our veins or anything like that. So yeah, it's good to add to food, but it's not meant as a supplement or to be injecting in. In terms of the fatty acids, kind of most people know that the omega-3s are considered anti-inflammatory, whereas the omega-6s are used by the body to make compounds that are involved in inflammation. The normal human diet, we're always going to be consuming more omega-6s than omega-3s, but we just want to make the ratio so that it's closer. So a recommended ratio would be 4 omega-6s to 1 omega-3, whereas in the average like North American diet, it might be anywhere from 12 to 1 to 25 to 1. So you see, we need to really increase our intake of omega-3s. And the way we can best do that is by including fatty fish. So the ones listed here would be the best ones. It's really those fatty ones, not as much the white ones. My favorite one is salmon. It's so easy. Even if you do canned salmon, it's just as good. And we want to be including that 2 to 3 times per week. You can also add the plant-based sources of omega-3s to your diet, but they're not going to be quite as good as the ones from fish. So if we're looking for the heart health benefits, really you're going to get the best bang from your buck from the fish ones. And earlier in the Hodgkin's lymphoma session, we were talking about how sometimes you have cardiovascular health you want to worry about after your treatment. So that's something I would definitely recommend for all those people. And then to reduce our omega-6s, the one easy thing we can do is to eat a little bit less red meat. So you don't have to avoid it altogether, but often our diet includes a lot more of it than we actually need. Limiting dairy to 2 to 3 servings per day. I personally am a fan of things like yogurt and milk. They have a lot of protein and things like that that our body really needs, but we don't need to be having like 5 or more servings per day. And then using olive oil and canola oil in the place of other oils. So for canola oil, I really use that if I'm going to be doing high temperature cooking. Olive oil is awesome. It's great for salads and low temperature cooking, but it has a much lower smoke point than canola oil, and you really don't want it to start smoking when you're cooking because that's not good for us either. So those are really the 2 I would recommend to keep in your pantry. Next, we'll move on to some 3 common nutrition myths. So the first one a lot of people ask about is sugar and cancer. So what we know is that sugar alone does not promote cancer. Sometimes people might think there's a link between sugar and cancer, but it might be more due to the elevated blood sugar levels, which can increase your insulin levels, and then that might increase the risk of certain cancers. I think consuming sugar as part of an overall healthy diet is fine, and in fact, I think when we don't make as big of a deal about it, it actually helps us because we're not as anxious, and really, I find a lot of people are very anxious around food, and that can be even worse for our health than just consuming some sugar once in a while. And also, avoiding sugar will not change the growth of your cancer. So if you start trying to do a sugar-free diet completely, it's not really going to change your cancer all that much, according to the research that I've seen. So some really actionable tips would be, 1, to limit your added sugar. So earlier I mentioned that the World Health Organization suggests no more than 25 to 50 grams per day. They kind of calculated that out as less than 10% of our total daily energy intake. So if you're eating more calories, then you might have a little bit more room there, but I would suggest sticking to under 50 grams per day on average if you can. So obviously if it's your birthday and you're having a piece of birthday cake, it might be a little higher, but that would just be doing simple things like not having juice or sweetened beverages a lot. And then choosing low glycemic index foods more often. So by a show of hands, how many of you know what the glycemic index is? Good, yeah, so a lot of people here. Basically, the way I like to break it down and explain it, it's basically a scale that ranks carbohydrate-containing foods by how much they increase your blood sugar. So when I'm working with people with diabetes, we talk about choosing things that are whole grains. Those are going to be lower on the glycemic index than something like a piece of white bread, which is actually right at the top, or like basically 100. That could also be choosing things like oatmeal instead of like sweetened cereals, or choosing sweet potatoes instead of like a baking or russet potato. If you're more curious about that, I would recommend talking to your dietitian. They can definitely help you incorporate that. The next one is about detox diets. So whether you have cancer or not, I find that detox diets are a very hot topic in nutrition. People are always asking me. Really, there's no evidence to suggest that these help anything in the body. What I already explained to people is that we have a liver and kidney, and those are the body's natural detoxification systems. We don't need to do these types of diets, and they usually end up being more restrictive and harmful, and especially if we're trying to do all those things like I mentioned earlier, like maintain our lean body mass, prevent nutrient deficiencies. Some of these detoxes or cleanses involve only having one food for a week, or like cauliflower or cabbage, or sometimes they're like just lemon and ginger water. I've seen all different types of detoxes. That's not really going to be health promoting, and I definitely don't think it's going to help our cancer. And then the last one is about organic foods. So to date, there's been no evidence to really suggest that eating organic food will actually reduce your cancer risk. When I'm thinking about this with people, it can be very expensive too. So sometimes people actually say, well, if I'm not going to buy organic fruits and vegetables, I'm just not going to buy them. That's much worse for our health than buying conventionally grown produce and still including in our day. Really, I think it comes down to personal preference. So if you have the resources and you want to choose organic, that's by all means, go ahead. But if you don't and you want to just buy the regular stuff, that's what I buy anyways, and I'm a dietitian. So unless it's on sale, then I'm like, oh, I'll just go for these ones. But yeah, to date, the research doesn't show anything conclusively, so it's up to you. And now we're going to quickly touch on how do I know which information to trust. So on the internet, there's a lot of information, but especially for nutrition. So these are some questions I suggest people ask themselves when they're reading articles or certain things. So the first one is someone promising a quick fix or a miracle cure? If so, then I don't think that's a very reliable resource, because nutrition is not black and white. As much as I wish we could say, like, this food does this 100% of the time, this food does that, it doesn't really work like that, especially not in our bodies. And research studies around nutrition are so complicated because we can never isolate out certain foods and say, like, randomize two groups of people. This one group of people will never eat this food, and this one group of people will eat it for 30 years. Like, it's really hard to do good nutrition studies, so just be careful of that. But yeah, there's not really quick fixes or miracle cures. Another thing is, what are they selling? So if someone is telling you, oh, this thing is the best thing for you, like, you really need this type of supplement, and then they have a link to their website that sells that supplement, I don't know how reliable that's going to be. Certain websites too, like wellness websites, like Goop by Gwyneth Paltrow, like, is she qualified to give nutrition information? I don't think so. Where it gets tricky sometimes is sometimes people who are qualified give bad information. So Dr. Oz, for example, he's a wonderful cardiologist, and he gives the worst nutrition information on his website. Yeah, I just can't explain the amount of people that come to me after seeing something on Dr. Oz, and I'm like, what? I never heard of that. So, yeah. Personal stories as well. So anecdotes are really strong. Sometimes people think if something works for them, that it will work for everybody, but this is not the case. Again, I talked a little bit about the medical experts. Usually you can trust doctors and dietitians. Like I said, try to make sure it's based on those types of things, but no matter what, you want to use it with like a watchful eye and make sure the information's good. And then two, you know, when you're scrolling on Facebook or online and you see, oh, this study says like wine is equivalent to going to the gym, and then this study says like coffee will extend your life by this many years. Sometimes they're based on these really small studies, so even though they are based on research, it's not really the best research. For every study you find that says wine's great for you, you can find one that says it's not so good. Same with coffee and same with lots of other things. So if you're looking for resources, like I mentioned, I think this is an awesome book written by a Canadian doctor and dietitian, so it's really, really good. There's also one from the American Cancer Society, What to Eat During Cancer Treatment. These both have lots of recipes as well, and they sort them based on the type of side effects. So for instance, whether it's like nausea, trouble swallowing, sore mouth or throat. So I'd really recommend both of these books. And the dietitian I mentioned, she also has a Cancer Bites blog where she answers really popular questions, frequently asked questions, dispels some more myths. So if you want to peruse the internet, I would suggest maybe going to that website. I also found online an e-cookbook from Princess Margaret that has recipes developed by dietitians for people with cancer, and it's really nice as well. That's a free resource you can access. If you're looking for resources that aren't just related to cancer and nutrition, you can go to unlockfood.ca. So that is run by Dietitians of Canada, so all of the recipes and all of the information is based on evidence. And same with dietitians.ca. So if you're looking more specific, especially for handouts or resources, you can go on there as well. If you are in Ontario, you can call telehealth. It's only Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., but they do have a dietitian who will answer nutrition questions. But just to be clear, that's a great resource for one-off questions, but it's not an individual counseling service. So they're not going to develop a personal relationship with you or be able to answer questions that are very, very specific to you and your treatment. The best place to find a registered dietitian when you're actively undergoing treatment would be the clinical dietitians at your hospital or treatment center. I know my sister actually never saw a dietitian. I guess it depends on how you're doing nutritionally. Like she was fine, but you can always ask to be referred to one because they usually do have dietitians on staff. If you're done your cancer treatment and you belong to a family health team, some family health teams also have dietitians that you can access for free, and you can set up appointments with them. There's also in-store dietitians, which is one that I am. So if you go to www.bookadietitian.ca, you can enter your postal code, and that will tell you stores near you that have dietitians. So I mentioned that I work for Loblaws under the Zehrs banner, but there's also dietitians at Sobeys. So that's the only two in Ontario grocery stores that have them. But that can be really helpful if you have questions about a specific product, if you're trying to read the nutrition label, or if you want some more help in terms of actually incorporating certain nutrients into your diet. It can be really practical. There's also private practice dietitians, so you can go to Dietitians of Canada and they have a Find a Dietitian tool. So in Ontario, there is pretty good access to dietitians, so you can use any of those tools and see if you can find one. And especially if you're having issues with your eating or with your weight, keeping it up or down, it's good to reach out. Now, does anyone have any questions related to nutrition? Yes. That's a great question. So you're asking about diet supplements. I try to get all of the nutrients you can from food first because you don't really, not overdose, but you can't really get too much of specific nutrients from just general healthy eating. When people start supplementing, that's when we can actually be getting too much. For the general healthy population, I sometimes explain that a common thing is that Canadians have the most expensive urine in the world because a lot of the supplements we take are water soluble and they're released in our urine. So when our body gets enough that we need, we just kind of pee out the rest. Any specifics, I would definitely talk to your own personal dietitian about it because it's very hard to make blanket recommendations. For example, even something as simple as an iron supplement, certain people can't take iron supplements. First of all, it has side effects like related to the gut. You might get very constipated, but also certain medical conditions that can actually be harmful to your liver, or some people have something called hemochromatosis where you can get way too much iron. So I would be very careful with the supplements, especially any natural health products, because right now they have all kinds of claims on them that are not substantiated with any evidence. So that's a great question, and I wish I could be more specific, but yeah, it's not the easiest.
Hi. I wanted to ask you about sugar substitutes.
Yes.
And is there sugar in the substitutes that we should be counting towards our 10% of sugar that we're allowed to have in the day?
So that's a great question. So in terms of sugar supplements, there's a huge variety of them. They all have different names, and then they have like the brand names. Like for instance, sucralose is commonly known as Splenda. There's different ones that are sugar alcohols. So they would end in like OL. Or there's things like stevia, which some of you might have heard of. It's a natural non-nutritive sweetener. And when we say non-nutritive, what that means is it doesn't contribute any calories or any sugar to your diet. So when things like pop that have like maybe aspartame, they don't actually contribute any sugar to that overall free sugars because there's no sugar in it. So sometimes people used to recommend that, especially for people with diabetes. They would say like if you're having sweetener, it shouldn't theoretically increase your blood sugar. The problem with that is that some of them do have side effects. Like if you have more than 10 grams of sugar alcohols a day, you can get quite bad diarrhea. So what I would prefer is actually just less amount of regular sugar. So it's mixed on this. Some people are very adamant that sugar substitutes are what we should go for, especially with people with diabetes, but I don't know. Like sometimes we're seeing the research now. I don't know how good the study is about it, but some of you might have seen the one that was talking about risk of stroke for people who have high intake of like diet beverages, like using sweeteners, and it didn't look so good. So I just think overall it's better to reduce our intake of total sugar, regardless of whether it's a sweetener or not. And plus, when we have a lot of sweeteners, that can actually increase our taste preference for very sweet things. Does that kind of answer your question? Oh, like equal and yeah, and those types of sweeteners. Like how, like, it's very hard to, what's the actual question, sorry?
Sorry, it's about I've heard or I've read that there's a connection between the blood transferring into the brain and it leading to things like dementia and things and that kind of thing.
Oh, so are you talking about like when people are suggesting like ketogenic diet because it's like lower in carbs and lower in sugar to help the brain?
Well, I wasn't thinking about ketogenic. I was thinking about a study that indicates that a large amount of sweetener substitutes can contribute to those kinds of things. And I didn't know if you had an opinion on that.
Yeah.
Or,
So my only opinion, I'm sorry I don't have a better answer, but it would just be to try to decrease our intake of both the substitutes and just regular sugar in general.
okay, thank you.
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, so for when we do have celiac, that can bring up another barrier because we're obviously not going to have anything with wheat, rye, barley, triticale. All of those are off limits. Quinoa is a great one. Rice is gluten-free as well. And then there's lots of other grains. Those wouldn't necessarily be considered whole grains, but are good for us. So, for example, things like potatoes, that is like a starchy carb. That can be part of that category, even though it's not technically a whole grain. As well, things like there's like chickpea pastas made of lentils. There's lots of great options for people with celiac disease. And if you haven't seen a dietitian, I would recommend that as well because they can give you lots of options. But yeah, my main would be quinoa and rice.
Hello. What are your thoughts on the Mediterranean diet and also practicing intermittent fasting?
So the Mediterranean diet, I'm actually not a big fan of most diets in general. It's the one that I would say does have good evidence to support it in terms of hypertension and other benefits, and it's very reasonable and realistic compared to other diets. So basically increasing our intake of fish, whole grains, fruits and vegetables, and very much limiting things like meat. So that's a great diet. The problems I have with intermittent fasting, it's very similar to other diets in that I don't know how sustainable it is. So certain people can be successful on that for a short while, but I don't know. And there's different types of intermittent fasting as well. So there's ones where you fast for 16 hours and then you eat for 8 hours. And then there's ones where it's 5 and 2. So 5 days you eat like normal, 2 days you fast. There's a wide variety of different intermittent fasting diets. It's really not my favorite, I must say, because I'm a big proponent of listening to your body and trying to fuel yourself when you need to, not trying to binge and get in all the food you need during a certain eating window. And I've also heard basically intermittent fasting could kind of be what people used to consider just skipping breakfast, right? Because lots of people just will eat from like 12 to 8 or 11 to 7. So yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of it, but that would be definitely something as well you could address with your dietitian or your healthcare team.